That's a bit much. Can we have some lights for a minute? Since we have a couple remarks at the beginning. More light, not less. Great, thanks. Tonight's event is in partnership with Community Advocates, and it's broadcast on Facebook Live. We will be taking a break next week. We'll be back Tuesday, October 23rd, to discuss how fair is the free press with the Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy at Wallace Annenberg Hall. I first tonight want to thank David Lehrer from Community Advocates for partnering with us and ask him to say a few words. David?
Thank you, Bob. I'm David Lehrer of Community Advocates. On behalf of our chair, former Mayor Richard Reardon, we're proud to once again co-sponsor with the UNRWA Institute the series of programs as we did last year. Tonight's program, with its distinguished panel, will examine a critically important topic that has not been receiving the media's attention that it deserves. While the nightly news and cable programs rightfully obsess over the Trump administration's latest conduct, they ignore the subtle and not so subtle erosion of the nation's voting rights protections, actions that in fact can have very long-term implications for our democracy. Whether it is the closing of polling places in rural areas, to the imposition of onerous voter ID laws, to the apocryphal assertion that millions of illegal aliens are voting in our country, this is an issue and topics and related ancillary topics that need our attention. Tonight, those of us here and those watching on the net will learn something from these well-informed panelists. I trust you will enjoy the evening, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, David. There's something special about tonight, and I'm going to welcome Tim Smith. Matt Keller, his other executive producer of this documentary, Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook, is caught in traffic. Oh, you're here. Oh, good. So I want to acknowledge and welcome both of them, and we're going to start tonight, thanks to their generosity, by seeing an excerpt of the documentary they've just made, narrated by Robert Redford. Timothy and Mac, you want to come up for a minute, or Tim?
Thanks, Bob. Thank you all for coming. No one has seen this film before today, so you're the first preview audience of it. It's a 20-minute excerpt. We shot it during the 2016 presidential campaign and other elections. It's called Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook. We document basically how voter suppression works in different plays. What you're going to see today is what we shot during the 2016 election and a couple plays from that election. One is voter purges, one's voter intimidation, the other is voter ID. So without any further ado, I think we will go to the film. No.
Thank you very much. So we have thousands of people outside trying to get in, but we should start. Do we agree?
We're fighting vote fraud, if you are interested in that.
Of course, we were worried about vote fraud.
Yeah, I am too.
We're worried about
Read
vote
that.
fraud in North Carolina.
But people will. They'll vote many times. Somebody coming up and voting 15 times for Hillary.
I think he's going to win, unless the only way she can win is if she steals the election.
That's what I'm afraid of too, which is why you need to read that and decide if you want to fight vote fraud, if you care about it.
And I will not tell you to vote 15 times. You won't vote 15 times.
In 2016, for the first time, a major party presidential candidate, Donald Trump, and his vice president running mate, Mike Pence, were preaching the gospel of voter fraud and rigged elections.
Do you agree with your running mate, Donald Trump, that polling places in this country are going to be rigged?
In recent years, we've had instances, proven instances of voter fraud, and that's why...
The 2016 election offered a chance to see up close how the voter suppression playbook was working. The first stop was North Carolina.
My name is Michael Evan Hires. I'm a 100% disabled veteran. I'm not married. I have the time, I have the skills, and have a desire to make sure that every American vote is legally cast.
The Voting Integrity Project is interesting. They've always had a bit of a gadfly, renegade, vigilante voter fraud, crusaders. They claimed that thousands of non-citizens were voting in the state where they would challenge voters at county boards of elections, and then they couldn't prove that really any of those were true.
Is there anyone in the audience today who received a notice that if they wished their name not to be removed from the voter rolls, they should be present? Stand up then and give us your name, please, ma'am.
Randy Burkhead.
Okay, sir. John.
Well, North Carolina has a provision where a citizen can challenge the right of another citizen to vote. It's been on the books forever. Who else is going to know who's registered to vote unless another citizen does it?
Some of the laws that wind up being discriminatory today had discriminatory intent when they were first written in the early 1900s as part of the Jim Crow laws. For example, voter purging laws to cleanse the rolls.
And this was typically used in the Jim Crow era by whites who were trying to prevent newly enfranchised African Americans from having access to the ballot box.
Michael's methodology involves finding voters that the state identified as inactive.
These people have missed 2 federal elections, so they were listed as inactive. And I started sending letters to these inactive voters on the Cumberland County voter rolls.
The ones that came back marked by the post office as undeliverable are considered evidence that the voter no longer resides at that address. And Mike challenged those voters.
Voter challenge envelopes are marked "Do Not Forward." If a resident moves in the district, even across the street, he or she will not receive notice their registration is being challenged or know to come to the Board of Elections hearing to contest the challenge.
What the letter essentially says to Pyramid maintain my voter registration as it is currently today. Whoever this guy is has challenged my right to vote. The only way to defend your registration was to go in person. The process heavily favors the person doing the challenging. Not everybody is going to get a letter or have the time to defend it.
What do you want this board to know concerning your place of residence?
My primary place of residence is the address on my voter registration.
Yeah, I'll make a motion that the challenge to Ms. Burkett be dismissed.
Second. Okay. All in favor, say aye. Aye. The challenge against you is dismissed. Your voter registration remains. Now let's move on to Mr. John Lamont McKeithen Jr.
Some people have the knack of spotting anomalies. It's kind of like seeing a lump of coal in a bale of cotton. It'll just pop right out at you.
Let me just ask you, what do you want this board to know concerning your place of residence?
I do live and have lived at 7790 Stony Point Road.
It says 7790.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this says 7770.
Is there a possibility that people got struck from the rolls mistakenly because the post office did not appropriately deliver the mailings to them? There is a small possibility on that.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give concerning this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All the evidence shows that when someone is purged from the rolls, it's extremely unlikely that they're going to re-register. It's hard to get them to re-register. And I worry that it will diminish the will to participate in the political process.
And the danger is if states use unreliable information to take voters off the rolls, and if they do not give voters adequate notice and an opportunity to contest their removal, then we could have a situation where hundreds or even thousands of legitimate voters are being taken off of the rolls without their knowledge.
To reverse Mike Hires and Jay Delancey's voter purge and purges in other North Carolina counties, Reverend Barber and the NAACP asked the federal court to intervene.
Good morning. Persons were engaging in an attempt to get voters purged, especially African Americans. We are fighting this. We believe and we hope that the courts will agree with us and we will have an immediate temporary restraining order.
Reverend Barber, that guy's made a name for himself. congratulate him on a well-funded. He has a lot of out-of-state funding money, and he knows how to play that race card better than anybody I've seen, and really since the heyday of Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, he has played that race card so well.
The NAACP filed a voter suppression lawsuit against the North Carolina Board of Elections, and today they won that case with a federal judge declaring that all voters purged from the voting rolls must be reinstated.
The NAACP in North Carolina, they filed a lawsuit in federal court, and actually they went judge shopping. They found a black female judge that they could influence emotionally, in my opinion, and not so humble opinion at that.
Those of us who are the descendants of people who had their cars blown up outside of churches right here in North Carolina when they were inside the church organizing for voting rights. When you come from that kind of lineage, you're not going to allow some loudmouth bigot to intimidate you.
The courts have said, you can't do any of this kind of stuff in the last 90 days. But they're going to put all these names back on the roll. We had a guy who worked for 2 years and got over 6,000 names removed in Cumberland County.
And they claimed that we were targeting blacks. I would be glad to get drug into federal court because that will give me the opportunity to expose the problems that we have in this state. I get 3 hots and a cot and full medical care if I go to jail. Except how are you going to put me in jail for following the law?
The next stop, Rock Springs, Texas. Here, a local sheriff seemed to be practicing an old-fashioned but effective voter suppression technique, voter intimidation.
The whole idea is to make voting seem like a dangerous proposition, that it's something that might get you in trouble. And again, what that does is over a period of time, it insulates Republicans against the effect of African American Hispanic population growth.
In Edwards County, Texas, we received reports that the local sheriff who's connected to the militia movement and who prides herself on being, this tough cowgirl sheriff, she had actually engaged personally in efforts to intimidate voters.
The issue of voter fraud has been very prevalent since I've been here. They're tired of, you see it, you know it, everybody around you knows it. Why isn't someone doing something about it?
Who's 814?
Frank, thanks for the deal.
814, how long has he been here?
He's been here since the first of the month.
Since the first of the month?
Yeah.
The sheriff has alleged people voting incorrectly that have not. She has threatened to investigate people for illegal voting that have not. She has someone in jail now.
I'm not guilty of nothing because I did the right thing. As I went to go do it, I asked.
The gentleman is under arrest for voter fraud and voter impersonation. He's accused of impersonating his grandfather. There's no way a 40-year-old man is going to be mistaken for someone who's almost 100 years old.
In the first case, he went to prison for delivery of a controlled substance. Once he was on parole, he pretty much knew he wasn't supposed to vote. It was just probably catch me if you can or ha ha ha. I don't really know the motive behind it. I guess maybe one day he'll tell us. But at this point, he's just kind of trying to play the victim.
I do feel that it was a mistake that was done by the ladies working the poll in not actually comparing the date of birth. The date is clearly stated on the registered list as 8/9/1915.
Now, Manuel was on parole. He should not have voted, but the election officials shouldn't have allowed it either. He asked if he could vote. That tells me that he didn't know if he could or not.
The intimidation comes in the arrest itself. Him sitting in jail would send a very strong message to a lot of people and intimidate a lot of people as to not to go out and vote.
When we throw this sheriff out, this intimidation will come to a stop. This is voter suppression, and it's illegal. You have the exact same power in this election as I do, as the person next to you. And you have, together, a whole lot more than Pam Elliott does.
Are you ready? Texas, our Texas, so wonderful, so great.
I just want to thank everybody here. This election has been, and I hate to say it, horrible. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Horrible things being said, horrible mud being slung, all in an effort to rid Edwards County of little old me.
You have leg restraints, or? Because I think Sheriff wanted him in leg restraints.
So, Sheriff, she has been diligently trying to root out the corruption ever since she took office over here. She already has. We've had more arrests ever. Perhaps this might make some of the people who are entertaining the idea of voting illegally, it may wake them up and say, hey, they're not going to let me get away with it if I get caught.
This county has the highest rate of voter fraud allegations with the Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office than any of the other 254 counties in the state. Houston's got 10 million people in it. We've got 1,100, and we have a higher rate of voter fraud? Please.
There was one more stop before Election Day, Jefferson City, Missouri. The state's Republican legislators were debating placing a voter ID requirement on the November ballot.
2006, there were only 2 states in the country that had what I'd call a strict voter identification requirement. And then all of a sudden, after the 2008 election, we have a wave of laws, unheard of virtually, that make it harder for people to participate, and in almost every instance, disproportionately hit precisely these segments of the electorate that are emerging. So it's hard for someone like me to look at that and think this is just a coincidence.
House Bill 1631 has been from the very start about integrity in our election process here in Missouri. Pure and simple. House Bill 1631 is the implementation of photo voter ID in the state of Missouri. Implementing procedures to safeguard against fraud helps ensures that qualified registered voters' votes are not diluted by unlawful activity.
And what is that?
That is what photo ID is trying to do.
Is,
so you think protecting against fraud is a bad idea?
I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, gentlemen. We have protections against fraud right now. Stop trying to confuse people and sensationalize an issue to back up your point of view. Be intellectually honest about what's going on.
Where are you coming from on this case?
What can you point to? What voter identification fraud can you point to that's happened in the state of Missouri that your bill would address?
How do you, without this implementation in effect,
That's what we call a non-responsive answer, because you did not respond. That's okay. I understand. I would implore the body to think real hard about their vote on this and ask them to vote no. Thank you.
All those in favor will vote yes. All those opposed will vote no. Mr. Clerk, please ring the bell and open the board. Mr. Clerk, please close the board and tally the vote. By your vote of 115 yes and 41 no, you have sustained the gentleman's motion.
There is a temptation for the majority to restrict voting rights of the minority because it helps them stay in power.
To say that our intent is to try to disenfranchise any individual in the state of Missouri is completely absurd. That is a very serious accusation and very and something that I don't take lightly. Your vote is your own, and it's extremely important in a democracy. I'm just trying to put more integrity into our voting process.
We're very honored to have the Reverend Cassandra Gould with us.
I wear this shirt. My mom's name was Carrie.
My mom was, I was born in a little town in Alabama, 47 miles from Selma. My mother was a voter rights worker. I really used to get sick of my mom's stories about what it meant to be in Selma and how she marched and how she was there before Dr. King. Mom, I don't want to hear about Selma anymore. I mean, we got it made now. We can actually go and vote. So I thought. Voter restriction laws are designed to take us back to the time that my mother was fighting in Selma. It's dancing on the grave of civil rights workers who gave their lives so that people could vote. It is not just about photo ID. That is code word for let's cut out some citizens. And who are the legislators to get to decide who gets to have a right that they already have? Let's vote no on Amendment 6. So you voted yes on Amendment 6? Oh, you voted no. Okay, great. Yeah. My son here, Danielle, we've been running these phone banks in St. Louis and other places.
This is a perfect night to call because of the debate.
This is Reverend Gould over at Missouri Faith Voices. How are you today?
We want people to really focus on thinking local. ABC, always be closing.
I just had a quick question for you. This November on the ballot, they have Amendment 6 that's going to restrict voters' rights in Missouri. Oh, I think he had too much to drink.
Will you stand with me to vote no against Amendment 6? All right, I'm glad I can count on you, Fred.
Just remind them to get out there and to vote no on Amendment 6.
Done and done. That's how you do it.
In the summer of 2016, while Missouri mulled the pros and cons of voter ID, federal courts struck down or modified several of the more restrictive state voting laws passed since 2011.
In another important story tonight, North Carolina's law requiring voters to show photo ID was thrown out by a federal court that said the law was designed to bar Black Americans from the polls. This is the third time this month that similar laws were struck down, the others in Texas and Wisconsin.
The important role of the judiciary would not be forgotten by Republicans. The next play would need to include changing the federal courts. But that would have to wait for another day.
Okay, our panel is heading up to the stage, and we'll be with you in a minute. So that was a, is this on? No. Yeah. Okay, that was a fascinating excerpt from that film. Let me introduce our panelists. Timothy Smith, who was one of the people who made that film, former senior producer at MSNBC, who's also produced interviews with Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Joe Biden, Ted Kennedy, Donald Trump, and Mitt Romney. Danielle Cendejas, senior vice president at the Strategy Group, where she manages campaign plans and direct mail programs, notably for LA Mayor Eric Garcetti. By the way, she worked on President Obama's 2008 presidential campaign as a field organizer and a delegate tracker. Christian Grose is the associate professor of political science and public policy here. He's my colleague. He's also the academic director of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy in the Price School of Public Policy. And Gentry Collins is the former political director of the Republican National Committee. Before that, he was National Political Director of the Republican Governors Association, Midwest Campaign Manager for John McCain in 2008, and a fellow this semester at our Center for the Political Future. Incidentally, every Monday at 4 p.m. in SOS B15, we have Politics and Pastries, an informal gathering with Gentry and Dan Schwerin, our other fellow this semester, and Hillary Clinton's longtime chief speechwriter. Tim, I have a first question for you, but I got to ask, what happened in Missouri on November 6th?
Unfortunately, the voter ID law did pass. Manuel, who was the person in jail, stayed in jail for 16 months without a trial. He finally figured out that he needed to plead guilty if he was ever going to get out, so he finally pled guilty. So, and the voter purge in North Carolina, we found several voters who were purged and weren't able to vote. So it wasn't a happy story.
So has voter suppression and the effort to fight it changed since you started making this film?
Well, it's only, with Trump winning and claiming that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally, and then he set up his Voter Integrity Commission, which blew up, fortunately, but was run by Vice President Pence and Chris Kobach. And Kobach would like to institute a citizen's requirement for all voter registration, which would be very onerous. And now in North Carolina, there's actually another ballot initiative for voter ID, which the courts had thrown out, but now it's on the ballot ID. The one thing that's positive, but it probably won't pass, is in Florida there's also an initiative to allow felons to vote. There are 1.3 million felons in Florida who can't vote, which might explain what happened in 2000.
And this does have a differential impact on minorities, right?
Yes, very much so.
And do you see this, how's this going to impact the midterms?
I mean, a number of the laws, as we pointed out, were thrown out by the courts towards the end of 2016. Obviously, Trump is now changing the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but the lower federal courts. So those initiatives might not get thrown out. How it'll affect the midterms, I'm not 100% sure.
So, Christian, I'm going to throw this to you for a minute. How impactful, let's talk about impact, are voter suppression efforts, including these voter ID laws, voter intimidation, on the local and national levels, and how much do they affect election outcomes?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of research, some of it's mixed, showing that these votes don't always have a direct impact, but then there's other research showing that they do. A lot of the research suggests that, much like the film, which I thought was very interesting, it's the tactics of scaring people about voter ID and other restrictive voting rights laws that actually deter people to vote. You don't need to necessarily be directly impacted by a specific restriction, but the presence of many restrictions deters people from turning out to vote. And so the laws themselves have this holistic effect on declining voter turnout. On the voter ID side in particular, there is some evidence that legislators who support voter ID, like the legislator in Missouri, not to call him out specifically, some research I did with Matthew Mendez, who's a former student here at USC, shows that legislators who supported voter ID laws also are less responsive to Latinos than to white constituents. And so the message, I think, is less about a direct impact of any one law, but many laws that have a restrictive content, and the same people who support the restrictive content are attempting to deter turnout.
Gentry, what do you think of that? I mean, this is a pretty heavy indictment of some of these Republicans. I know this would never happen in Iowa, where you're from, because people wouldn't tolerate it. But what do you think of this in general?
Well, I'd offer a couple of thoughts. First, when I was political director at the Republican National Committee, my job was to run voter turnout programs. And I will say that one of the reasons that I am skeptical of some of the claims of voter suppression is because we were routinely accused at the RNC of voter suppression. I personally was responsible for those programs. And I will tell you that our objective was to turn out Republican voters. There was no program, there's no program I've ever been aware of that was intended to limit anybody's right to vote. With respect to the voter ID laws specifically, my question for my Democratic counterparts has always been, photo ID is required for so many things that we do in the world, in the economy, when you go to travel, right? I mean, I can't board my flight tomorrow morning. I couldn't get into USC's library since I don't yet have a USC ID, right? So if that is such a discriminatory issue, then where is the policy that says this is not just important in voting rights, this is important everywhere, and we need to make it easier for disaffected communities to get these kinds of IDs. This is not just a voting issue.
Go ahead, give him the mic. Give him the mic. No, there's a mic down there.
I'll deliver a message in response to that argument. There are people in this country who don't fly on planes. There are people in this because they can't afford it. There are people in this country who don't have a driver's license because they can't afford a car and they don't get the license. There are people in this country who don't have the proper ID because they've tried to get the proper ID, but they don't have a birth certificate and they don't have the underlying documents and they don't have the money and the time to get them. It's a significant problem. The litigation over these voter ID laws in Texas and Wisconsin and a number of other states, and the research shows that generally 10% of eligible voters lack the voter ID required by some of these laws. In North Carolina, and not part that we showed in the film, the legislators in drafting the legislation asked what types of IDs are held by African Americans, what types of IDs are held by white people. In Texas, they asked the same. In North Carolina, and we've got the emails in the film, they got data about how people voted, early voting, voting on Sunday, et cetera. And we have Reverend Barber noting that those types of voting most frequently used by African Americans, those were the ones limited or eliminated by the legislature. Types of voting more likely to be used by whites were generally untouched. In Texas, types of ID generally held by disproportionately held by African Americans were disallowed as proper ID. Types of ID disproportionately held by whites were allowed as ID. Some people see a pattern here, some do not. And so the argument that just use your passport is not one that works for
I did not
Americans.
say just use your passport. I said if this is a problem in minority communities, then we ought to address it beyond just voting rights. We ought to say, look, there are a whole variety of things that my ID allows me to do. If you don't have one, we ought to make sure that everybody in the country that needs one, that rightfully is entitled to one, can get one. That's the point that I'm making.
I certainly wouldn't oppose that. I will note that the difference between getting on a plane and voting is that voting is a constitutional right, and not only that, but is the foundation, the basis for so many other rights that we hold. And so we ought to protect it especially. We ought to protect it first.
So you think maybe, and I want to bring Danielle in on this, but you, Gentry, you think maybe the solution here is to make it easy for everybody to get an ID?
In part, yes.
I mean, would you demand a birth certificate? Which some states do. I've never been asked for my birth certificate when I registered to vote. I don't even know where it is.
I mean, how do you get any other form of ID that's critical in our economy, right? Look, I mean, I'm a late joiner to the panel. I'm not prepared to answer that question today. What I'm saying is that to the extent that there is a problem in minority communities with getting a government-issued ID, photo ID, whatever the proper terminology is, then we ought to address that more broadly than simply saying it's acceptable that they don't have it.
Danielle, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think fundamentally, everyone deserves the right to vote, whether or not there are barriers to voting, whether that's ID, whether that is proof of address, whether, we're all taxed. Like, we all pay sales tax. And I think where it hurts people the most is college students. Some states don't allow you. My sister is getting her PhD in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, and there were laws floating around that wouldn't allow her to use her student ID to vote. And, you know, the legislature there and the governor are making laws that affect her research. She's getting a PhD in chemistry. They're affecting, you know, the type of housing that she's able to get, the type of classes, the type of aid. Those are all things that matter. And if you put a barrier saying you need to go down, she doesn't drive, so she doesn't need a driver's license. But if you need to go find, you know, take time out of your class schedule, out of your research schedule to go find a way to get a Wisconsin license or a Wisconsin ID, and then you get the right to vote, even though there are laws that are being made that, you know, affect her, that doesn't seem right to me. So I think it's really, you know, if we're going to demand IDs, then we need to make it, one, easier to get an ID. I don't know how many people have been heard the complaints about the California DMV lately, but we need to make it easier for people, and then we also need to make sure that, you know, the acceptable forms of ID are, you know, are widely accepted rather than limiting what those are. But I do think that fundamentally, you know, we sort of want to make sure we have trust in election systems, and so we shouldn't be demanding and putting barriers to participate in our democracy.
Christian?
Yeah, just I want to follow up on it a little bit, because when we talk about voter ID, it actually is different in each state, which I think the documentary gets into. So there's strict voter ID laws that are just require driver's licenses. And driver's licenses are differentially impacted, right, if you're very old, if you're younger, if you're a college student, if you're a racial or ethnic minority, you're just numerically less likely to have driver's licenses. And so in states like Kansas that have very strict requirements, that's where you're seeing the largest effect. There's other states that the ID can be extremely loose and it's almost any ID goes. The impact there is probably less. So I think it's important to separate out these strict voter ID laws that really have a differential impact, where you literally require a driver's license, and a lot of people don't have driver's licenses, from other forms of voter ID.
Gentry, why do you think Trump, and we're going to come to the audience, by the way, why do you think Trump campaigned so heavily on rigged elections? He said, this election is rigged, this election is rigged. What was going on?
I think Donald Trump believed he was going to lose the election, and I think fundamentally he wanted an excuse for that.
Did he maybe speak an unintended truth?
Well, if he did, it was certainly unintended.
Tim, I want to let you weigh in on this one more time, and then I want to broaden this topic out a little.
Voter ID is I mean, it's just one of many suppression techniques, so I don't want to spend too much time just sort of focusing on that, because, you know, obviously there's gerrymandering, which we also get into in the film, and then, you know...
We're gonna get into that here.
Yeah.
Well, then I'm going to broaden this conversation out to other ways in which elections are or are perceived to be rigged. Bernie Sanders supporters, and Danielle, I'm going to direct this to you, complained that the 2016 primaries were rigged because the superdelegates were all stacked in favor of Hillary Clinton. Can you explain this controversy, and what steps has the Democratic Party taken to deal with it?
Sure. So I was a delegate tracker for Obama's election in 2008, and that was probably the first time the superdelegates came into the spotlight. It was a daily tracker. We, in fact, in the office had a daily tracker on our board, you know, getting excited every time we got a superdelegate. It was sort of people were like, who are these people? Are they superheroes? They're really just party loyalists, and they're people we can consider part of the establishment. They're also members of Congress and former presidents and former DNC chairs. So they're people who make sort of the party apparatus of that. And, you know, the original intent of superdelegates when they were really founded in 1982 was to be a check on the sort of, you know, insurgent candidate, and making sure that we had a strong candidate seeking our party nomination, but also having a chance to win the presidency. So it was sort of a balance of kind of making sure that there was sort of a, you know, check on, you know, if somebody was sort of winning and then was like, well, wait a minute, this is not happening. So that was the intent. So yes, it was sort of intended to be rigged. I think the difference between, you know, when we look at 2008, the advantage on the superdelegate side was with Hillary Clinton, and we still, as the Obama campaign, won the election. And I think it's because you look at, there is a strategy, every single state and territory has a delegate selection plan. And so my first day on the job in Chicago, I was given 4 of these delegate selection plans, and they're like, learn this. This is our guidebook. And there's rules on getting on the ballot. There's rules on how to become a delegate. There's rules on making sure that, you know, we knew who the extra delegate, the unpledged add-on as it was called, the wild card delegate as we like to refer to it, who that person was and how do we make sure that that person's an Obama person. So there's a whole strategy that goes into it. I think where Bernie Sanders had a disadvantage was he wasn't a Democrat. He was always an independent. He sort of never really participated in the party. So to expect party loyalists and people who have dedicated their entire lives to the Democratic Party or have had very high levels of experience in the party to all of a sudden have an expectation that the person who hasn't been a part of our apparatus is going to get, you know, move these people towards them, that's, you know, I think was a sort of false calculation. I also think that, you know, without the unpledged delegates or the super delegates, he still wouldn't have won the election. And so that's another key piece, is that the super delegates have never overturned the outcome. But to prevent that from happening in the future, yes, the DNC has voted and implemented reforms so that unpledged delegates don't vote on the first ballot. So these new rules mean that the pledged delegates, the people who get selected based on the outcomes of the elections and the caucuses, are the ones who get voted to vote on the first round at the DNC convention. And if there is no consensus on the floor, that's when all hell breaks loose. Turn on your TV and grab popcorn, and that's when the unpledged data or the unpledged delegates, the super delegates, get to chime in. And so I think that reform is brand new. That will be implemented in 2020. The other reform was encouraging states to move away from caucuses and go to primaries, because caucuses are incredibly disenfranchising as well. You know, you can't vote absentee. You have to show up. There's oftentimes not childcare. There's also, you know, some of these places are not planned very well. And so if you have an insurgent candidate and there's 5 precincts supposed to caucus at one place, it gets very chaotic. And so there is sort of a reform in place to reform that piece as well. And people don't realize that caucuses are levels. And so, you know, you go to the Iowa caucuses and a month later there's another caucus, and a month later there's another caucus. So you're not even really guaranteed those delegates that you get on caucus night. Those change over time, and that's in every state that has a caucus. So it's a real commitment to be a part of that delegate system.
Gentry, this is right in your ballpark. Do you think Iowa's going to move away from its caucus?
No, but I think it should. I actually agree with this point. Caucus voting it makes it very hard to vote, both parties. And I think that it also, particularly in my party, though I think the Democratic Party is very much at risk of this moving forward, because it's so hard to vote, it encourages fringe results. Right? You think about the last several Republican caucus results in Iowa, and they certainly were not viable general election candidates who came out of there.
So I'm going to come down the line with another question about the legitimacy of the process. I am struck by the fact that Bernie Sanders said it was rigged and Donald Trump said it was rigged. And maybe if you think you're not going to win, you're going to say it's rigged. Although I think some of the evidence of this film of people trying to suppress votes is pretty powerful. But I'll come down the line, start with you, Gentry, and we'll just come all the way down. What does it mean for our democracy that the winner of 2 out of the last 5 presidential elections lost the popular vote? Is it fair to say that a voter in California has far less of a voice than a voter in South Dakota? And does the system designed in the 18th century, is it really going to work for the 21st century?
In a word, no. I think if you went to a national popular vote, that's something that I would support. What makes me nervous about this conversation is when you get into individual states saying, well, maybe we'll go to a proportional system, right? Which it seems to me opens up the opportunity for individual parties to say, I want a proportional system here and I want a winner-take-all system there because it advantages my party. So if we're going to have one set of rules, let's have one set of rules. I think that I do think the Electoral College system has outlived its usefulness.
Christian?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you sat down and decided let's design an election system, it would not be the Electoral College. The chances, though, of anything changing are very low because the people who would have to vote to change the Constitution have incentives to protect the rights of small states, right? So senators who represent small states where there's also population imbalances are unlikely to get behind electoral college reform. I do think that it is an issue in the last 5 elections in particular, where it's not just that, for democratic legitimacy, it's a problem. It's not just who won and who lost, but again, just the prospects of any sort of change in that regard I see would be pretty low.
Danielle, are we just steadily eroding the perceived legitimacy of our presidential elections?
Well, I'd like to say that California and South Dakota voters are in the same boat because they're not battleground states. So really, I mean, when you look at where the money is spent in campaigns and where candidates are spending their time and where all the efforts are, it's really coming down to whatever map decides to play. I mean, in 2008, we in the Obama campaign, decided to play in 18 states, and that kept shrinking down until we sort of got to the point of we could have multiple strategies to 270, here's what we're going to do and here's where we're going to play. And so, a voter in Iowa, Wisconsin, Colorado, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, all of a sudden has a lot of power. And then when you look down to it even more, you're really looking at 20 counties in the entire country that swing an election. And so that advantage comes down to, is your campaign communicating to the right people? Are they using the right mediums? Are they doing all of this? So it really is an unfair system. I agree that, if we really want to be truly democratic in the way we elect our presidents, we really need to reform the system. But the inertia of reforming the system is also very difficult as well.
Tim?
I think that one of the things I learned making this, not that I didn't know it before, but politics is really about power. And if you're in power, you change the rules or you keep the rules that work for you. And obviously the Republicans do it, but so do the Democrats. I mean, some of the worst, electoral laws are in New York State, which is pretty much Democratic. You can only vote on one day. I mean, the southern states actually have more liberal laws in the sense of early voting. So, it's whoever has the power sort of uses the rules to stay in power. And that's what the Republicans sort of realized in 2008 when Obama won with 25% of the minority vote. They sort of had to figure out, well, how we can either appeal to this new rising demographic or we can figure out a way to keep them from voting or discourage them from voting, which is really the game plan we lay out, how they sort of moved to red map, where they took over the state legislatures and then started gerrymandering and then started passing their voter suppression laws and so on and so forth.
Your reference to New York and the suggestion that both political parties, at least to some extent, less or more, have to clean up their act leads me to talk about gerrymandering. Both sides of the aisles practice it while denouncing it when it's done to them, when it disadvantages them. Right now, it advantages the GOP, although that could change depending on what happens in the midterm elections with the election of governors, and it could change for other reasons as well. Christian, what can we do to stop gerrymandering, or are we inevitably stuck with it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it depends on the state, right? California, as you may know, changed their system. One of the things Arnold Schwarzenegger was really interested in when he was governor was getting rid of the district lines being drawn by the legislature and instead being drawn by a nonpartisan commission. That was put to the ballot, and it passed both for the state legislature and for the congressional districts. We have some of the most competitive congressional elections now in the country, and that was paired with primary reform at the same time. So the increase in competition due to redistricting reform is possible. There are 4 states in November that have ballot initiatives to change to a similar nonpartisan redistricting commission system. And I also agree that both Democrats and Republicans, they have incentives. They're the incumbents. They want to get reelected. They're going to draw the lines themselves. In the case of the state legislature, perhaps one of the only ways to reduce that is to go to ballot initiatives in states where it's possible to change the laws.
As I recall, by the way, the U.S. Supreme Court only upheld the Arizona redistricting commission by 1 vote. And that could change with a new Supreme Court. Gentry, Iowa has a system that avoids gerrymandering, right?
Yeah, to the extent it's possible, right? And it I think is not dissimilar to the California system. The Nonpartisan Legislative Service Bureau, I think it's called, draws the lines on the basis of predetermined criteria. The legislature votes up or down. It's unamendable. And if they vote it down, it goes back to the Legislative Service Bureau for another drawing, I think several times before it goes to the court. And those districts are highly competitive, both legislative and congressional districts. And I think it's working well in our case.
Tim, what do you think? You mentioned gerrymandering earlier.
I mean, one of the things that we covered in the film was what's called Project Red Map, which the Republicans did in 2010, where they basically took over 10 state legislatures, and they really focused, $30 million on sort of state races for state senator or state rep that had only seen like $50,000 on a race. All of a sudden, got $300,000. Now, Obama and Holder are trying to do the same thing for 2020 because they realize that's
Obama and Holder.
Yes, they've set up a redistricting committee to basically be the parallel to Operation Red Map in 2010, because they realize that these districts will be all redone again in 2020 after the census.
So do you think their aim is to gerrymander as much as possible in states where you have a Democratic governor and Democratic legislators?
It seems that way. I mean, they saw how effective the Republicans were at it, and they really got sort of outfoxed and outsmarted in 2010, and they're trying to amend for that.
So are we suddenly caught in a system much like, I think, the last century of the Roman Republic, where everybody's going to use every legal device they can to try to keep power, regardless of how fair or unfair the rules are, regardless of whether they follow the spirit of the Constitution. But everybody's just going to do everything they can, and is that the only way forward?
I'll let the others try and answer that one.
I worry about this. I mean, the idea that somehow or other we're going to start trying people, we're going to drag people into court, we're going to try them, we're going to use the law as a political weapon, we're going to say, well, the other side gerrymandered terribly, so now wherever we can, we're going to gerrymander drastically. Is that what we have to do, Danielle?
Well, I think as long as we have winner-take-all elections, there's a winner and a loser. We don't have a proportional system where everyone sort of gets a few, seats, if you get a certain percentage of the vote. So I think the challenge really is that, as long as we have a winner-take-all system, we're still going to have a winner-take-all government. And I think that when it comes to redistricting, we can go the route and as political parties advocate to have independent initiatives and to have, panels. The people who were the most resistant, I think, to the California model was, congressional Democrats, because there were deals that get made in the legislature on who gets to keep what seat, and it turned out that the Democrats ended up gaining more seats out of California because of this independent structure. And so I think as we move forward, we can, I think as Democrats, we need to, one, concentrate on who actually makes these rules and making sure that we're, even in the conversation. And I think that is changing as a political strategy for the Democrats. But we also need to really embrace these reforms and take politics out of it where we can. And when it comes to voting and when it comes to gerrymandering, I think if we embrace that change, we're confident that with a rising generation that, thinks more like the Democratic Party, going to be okay. And I think that we have to kind of let that happen a little bit and let reforms, take place.
Christian, the system seems fragile to me in that we keep putting more and more and more pressure on it. And people talk about polarization, but I think even more fundamental is the wholesale loss of faith in institutions. Government, basically everything but the military. Government, churches, the democratic process, the election process. Is the media is the only choice for Democrats, for example, to say, well, the Republicans gerrymander, so I'm going to gerrymander. And by the way, there are other places where this has already happened. The state of Maryland is drastically gerrymandered in favor of Democrats in the congressional races. Is this where we're at and there's nowhere else to go?
Yeah, I think that, echoing some of these points, this is where we're at, but it's also always kind of been like this, right? And so the key is, what institutions do you choose, and what institutions can you get passed via ballot initiative, or can you convince legislators are in their interest? Voter ID laws, felon disfranchisement, A lot of them, in the case of felon disfranchisement, which the movie mentioned, that came about during the Jim Crow era, which was in order to limit people by race, but also had a political component to protect the power of the Democratic Party in the one-party South. Democrats in Texas engaged in gerrymandering back in the 1990s, even though the state was at the time turning really Republican. So I think this will always be there unless there's an intention to change the incentives of those who are charged with redrawing the lines or designing the institutions.
So it seems to me that the only way out of this, out of gerrymandering, would be if the Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional. Most of the people here are too young, but for a long time in this country, you were allowed to apportion districts, state legislative districts, for example, on the basis of geography and not just population. So the county of Los Angeles had one state senator, and counties upstate that had only a few thousand people had one state senator. And in 1962, in Baker v. Carr, the Supreme Court ruled one man, one vote. That was unconstitutional. It doesn't seem likely to me that this Supreme Court would probably go that far. In fact, they might go in the opposite direction. They might even undermine these commissions. But Gentry, don't you think that would be the best way forward for this democracy?
That what would be the best way forward? Undermining the...
No, the opposite. No, that the court would somehow or other say, you can't gerrymander. It's unconstitutional.
You know, sure, but then who gets to decide where the lines are drawn? I think it would be better that we go. I mean, I think the most successful model that I'm aware of is the nonpartisan commission model. I think that there are a lot of states where the courts are just as partisan as the legislatures, and I think if you want to further erode public trust, that's where you would put the drawing of the maps. I would much prefer to have a nonpartisan panel to the extent that's possible. Though, like any other institution, if they abuse their power over time, then trust will erode there as well.
Yeah, and you do it in some states, and other states aren't going to do it, and people are going to say, I'm going to gerrymander to my advantage. So maybe it's something we just have to live with. Tim, I want to come back to you. Have the media given enough attention, and somebody mentioned this right at the outset, David did, given enough attention to issues like voter suppression and gerrymandering, and how can that be changed?
Well, we're obviously experiencing it, trying to get this film out in the sense that there's so much incoming with Trump and what's going on in Washington that the media is just totally focused on him and what he's doing on sort of a daily or hourly basis, sort of tweet by tweet, that it's really hard to address sort of substantive issues that really are important to our democracy, but no one's listening. I mean, our democracy is slowly bleeding out, but no one is paying attention to it because they want to see what Trump's latest tweet was.
I will say that I learned about the Florida felon disenfranchisement from John Oliver on yeah. And so I think there are people out there who are doing these deep dives. It's just whether or not they have the audience and whether or not they're reaching, sort of a broader spectrum of people and their ideologies.
But even MSNBC, which, is obviously fairly liberal, I mean, they just want to talk about Trump all the time because that's what their viewers want to see. I mean, it's sort of what people want to see, so, they're giving them what they want. They don't want to hear about voter suppression.
Yeah, in thinking about the restoring the voting rights of felons who've completed their sentence, completed their probation, Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia then, decided to do this, and he signed an executive order restoring the voting rights of all 200,000 felons. And this goes to a point Gentry just made. The Virginia Supreme Court, which had been appointed over the years by people who were hostile to that idea, basically said you can't do that. You have to do individual pieces of paper for each of them. So believe it or not, he signed 200,000 pieces of paper. I mean, he just came into the office every morning and just started working, signing pieces of paper. I sense there's some frustration with the system in the audience and some interest in asking questions. Before I turn it over to the audience, I'd like to go down, and this time we'll start with Tim. What are your top-line recommendations for the actions citizens could take to strengthen the integrity of our elections?
I think they have to get involved, they have to vote, they have to register. I mean, part of what we're seeing that's going on and Trump talking about rigged and everything else is people just are getting so overwhelmed, and they're just saying, my vote doesn't count, I don't matter, and people are just, this is supposed to be a democracy, but people really have to take part in it, and I think the average citizen is just increasingly not doing that. And certainly in 2016, the turnout certainly dropped for minority voters, and it dropped for a lot of other voters, and that's the result we got.
Danielle?
Well, I think Taylor Swift yesterday restored my faith in democracy. In one Instagram post, it directed 65,000 people to register to vote in the state of Tennessee. And so I think, it shouldn't take Taylor Swift to get people to register to vote, but if it takes Taylor Swift to get you to register to vote, please do it. We need to participate. I think for a lot of the folks in this room who are under the age of 25, they're not expecting you to show up, and they're making rules to make it more difficult for you to show up if you even wanted to. And so I think making sure that your voice is heard, but also demanding more out of our elected officials and our legislators and our county registrars, and making sure that voting is easier. In LA County, the entire voting system is changing next year, and not too many people know that. And there was a lot of resistance to that change, but it really is going to, I think, work out to increase turnout, which LA County in the state of California drags every single election. And so I think that...
Can you describe that change?
Oh, sure. They're going to... your absentee ballot, actually this election is going to look completely different. No more Scantrons filling in bubbles, which is amazing. But also they're going to move from polling places to voting centers. And so you'll be able to go anywhere in the county. So say you have a class but you can't get home to your home precinct, you can actually go vote. They're going to extend the days that the voting centers are open so that you can go and cast your ballot. They'll pull up print out a personalized ballot for you. You can also download their app, and you can put in your picks, and then you could you take the QR code and scan it in, and it prints out your ballot for you, and you just press it. The system's really, really cool. I got to play with it. And so, but it's really going to fundamentally change the way we interact with voting here in Los Angeles County.
And that's similar to Colorado.
Right, it's a similar system to Colorado, and LA County is unique because there was concern about people who go to their church every election cycle and cast their ballot at the church, and then all of a sudden the church changes on them, and that person has 40 years of experience going to that particular polling place. So the LA County system is unique. The rest of the counties in California have the option to go to a Colorado system where everyone gets mailed a ballot, and there's drop-off boxes, and you mail it back. But it's really exciting, but it also is, we want to make sure that, when we're targeting voters and figuring out who do we talk to, it's usually based on vote history. So we're not necessarily talking to people who are at the margins and trying to bring them into the process. And I think that is a challenge of, the more that you get involved, the more that we're going to, take into consideration what your issues are and what we're going to be able to do to really change our democracy.
Christian?
Yeah, I echo all these points, but I also would say just pay attention to history. A lot of the stuff that's happening now is a different version of things we've seen over the many years, right? If you think about the gerrymandering, it's an innovation that occurred because of what I think is a really good court decision, Baker versus Carr, that Professor Shrum mentioned, but that's what allowed, along with computer technology, for people to engage in such levels of redistricting. And so to sort of anticipate what the next innovations might be, that could be bad innovations and what could be good innovations, and try to work for those. I think voting is important. The chances your vote will swing an election is low. As you know, if you take my class, we talk about this. You're more likely to influence outcomes of elections if you engage as a volunteer, if you sign up and work for campaigns, focus on ballot initiatives that are important to you, and engage in participation in addition to voting.
Having gone through Bush v. Gore, I think sometimes your individual ballot might actually matter
Still
a
wasn't
lot.
one vote, though.
Gentry?
Well, in addition to voting, and I would echo some of the comments about the importance of that, I might also add that I think change in states with strong majorities will come when there's integrity from members of the ruling party, right? So what does that mean for average citizens? If you're a Democrat in a democratically controlled state, that should not and you oppose gerrymandering, or if you're a Republican in a Republican-controlled state and you oppose gerrymandering, it takes a level of integrity that many of us unfortunately don't have in order to say, when you are in power, let's make rules that are fair to everybody that level the playing field. The minority party is not drawing lines, right? So Republicans are not drawing lines in California, and Democrats are not drawing lines in Texas. And so it takes the base of the ruling party to say, wait a minute, we want rules that we can live with when we're in the minority. And I think that's something that most of us probably aren't thinking of.
Of course, that was a Republican governor of California who put forward the ballot initiative that led to the system we have here now, where you really can't gerrymander. I said that was my last question. I do have to ask you one more, Tim. Who was that guy at the beginning of the movie who seems to spend all his time trying to disenfranchise people, and what's his motive? The one with all the binders. Maybe they borrowed the binders from Mitt Romney. I don't know.
He's with the Voter Integrity Project in North Carolina, and earlier in the film, we see an actual voter who was purged, by his process. I mean, he just sort of goes through all the voter rolls and finds people who haven't voted and sends letters out, but they not necessarily all come back, and he just seems convinced that there's voter fraud out there, and he's going to change it.
So you think that's what drives him? He's the conviction of voter fraud.
Yeah, I think he believes it. I don't think he's making it up. I mean, it's not true, but he believes what he does.
Yeah, I had a sense that he felt entitled.
Yeah, he's a zealot.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to turn this over to questions from the audience. We're going a little longer than we usually do because we had the film.
Hi there. I was hoping to get what you guys think is the most dangerous form of voter suppression. Is it voter ID laws, gerrymandering, or maybe even foreign interference with our elections?
I think the voter purges are probably the worst, and there's this whole process which we actually didn't even get into the film that Chris Kobach is doing called cross-check, where they go against, if your name is Tim Smith and you live in Mississippi and there's another Tim Smith in Georgia, you might be removed from the system, but it probably wouldn't be Tim Smith. It'd be Jose Manuel. I mean, they go after certain names that they think probably are not going to vote Republican. That's proven to be a very effective technique, and it happened in Florida in 1999, and they took off 30,000 supposed felons, and obviously you saw what happened in 2000 with Bush v. Gore.
Anyone else want to take a whack at that?
I think when you have different roles in different places, that's when things like voter suppression happen. Not every county gets to run their own show in America. Even in the New Hampshire primary, every town designated city clerk got to run the rules of the election. And so if they determined they wanted to do ballots on napkins, that was their determination. So I think anytime you have a process where local groups get to make the rules and they get to make their own rules and they can be different in each and every state, I think that's when we lead to these disenfranchisement problems. I think the other thing on gerrymandering is that's once the lines are drawn, it's in place for 10 years, and there's really not much you can change that. You can convince a lot of people of your ideology to come join you in your community, but that's still not going to swing an election. So I think those two things probably are really impactful.
That's, by the way, why you're seeing so much Democratic focus on gubernatorial races, while so much of the media is talking simply about congressional and Senate races. Because the governors elected in 2018 will have a big impact on reapportionment after the 2020 census. Christian, you look like you wanted to say something. No? Next question.
My question is more directed toward Gentry, but everyone's welcome to answer it. You mentioned earlier that when you were part of the RNC, you wanted to motivate voter turnout. But I'm from Arizona, and in the 2016 presidential election, our county recorder limited the amount of places where you could vote, and it was the more places that you could vote were in regions of higher socioeconomic status, whereas in regions of low economic status there weren't as many places to vote, and there was lines that were 6 to 8 hours to vote. And before the election, our state legislator passed a law that said you couldn't carry someone else's absentee ballot to drop it off at the polls. So it seems like on the state level, the Republican Party is suppressing voters. So where's like the communication from the National Republican Party wanting to get the voter turnout, and then in states kind of suppressing voters?
So I think that most secretaries of state that I'm familiar with are concerned with the integrity of the vote. You can argue that they're doing that the wrong way, fine, but that's been my experience with them. With respect to the RNC, the programs that I ran, we play by whatever the rules are in the state, but our objective at the party level was to turn out our voters. And so we weren't giving guidance to secretaries of state. We were looking to say, what are the rules? When can you vote? How do you have to be registered? And let's go turn out the people that we've identified that are going to support our candidates. So from the national party perspective, running a GOTV program is less about the rules and more about turning out your base.
I think each party has like a voter protection piece of their puzzle, and speaking from the Obama campaign, in my experience that was something that we were, incredibly concerned with, and they had lawyers who had volunteered their time to create a team that really kind of addressed these issues, so that if there was situations where, hey, there looks like there's less polling places in one place, that there was a team of attorneys who would pressure, and push to, county registrars and secretaries of state to, sort of open that up. That's sort of, a luxury on a presidential campaign when you have, a close to $1 billion budget. You're going to be able to afford sort of the best attorneys in the country to be able to push those things. But it is, it's one of those things where these laws get put into place if they don't hear from citizens like yourself saying, hey, the last election, it took me 8 hours to vote. This is wrong. You have to make your voice heard in that. Otherwise, people don't think it's a problem.
Well, here's an interesting example. In 2008, Obama carried Indiana. The Republican legislature then passed a law that any county with more than 250,000 registered voters would only be allowed to have one early voting site. It happened that those three counties were Indianapolis, Gary, and Fort Wayne, which are obviously minority counties. So I think the smaller rural counties could have as many early voting sites as they wanted. So I think that's, a blatant example of trying to suppress the vote. In a state where they were worried that it was going to go blue, so let's pass some laws so the people in the blue districts can't vote.
Yeah, I wonder if that should be subject to a court challenge, I would think. Yes, sir. Here, wait for the mic.
There's a slogan that the Occupy movement had, we are the 99%. It's obviously inaccurate, but people who've done the sociology, the people at the bottom who have not gone up with the economy, about 90.9%. versus the 9.1%. I believe the reason for all the voter suppression is it's hard to win elections with 9.1%, and the core value, the core constituency of the Republican Party over the past several decades, and maybe more, has been to support the right and power of big money, basically to have it all. And so they need to do voter suppression as part of their bag of tricks to prevent people power, democracy, from effectively competing against money power, plutocracy. We have to acknowledge that. That's the source. It is one trick. This was the film is great. There's another film by someone named Greg Palast who looks at Chris Kobach's Crosscheck a lot. I'd suggest you get involved. I don't genuinely believe you knew nothing about this and that it's against your interest.
Can I, the one thing we do here, we try to not challenge people's motives or to not suggest that they're not telling the truth. No, we can have a discussion, but I know Gentry. He's a person of genuine integrity, and he's become a friend. So I don't dispute with you, and you may have noticed he hasn't either.
Actually, I would. I mean, the Wall Street money went to Hillary Clinton, not to Donald Trump.
But on Chris Kobach, for example, I mean, I don't think Gentry would necessarily defend some of what he's done. His voter commission fell apart. He couldn't come up with anything. So I take it your question is, and it's sort of unfair to Gentry, but it's not an unfair question. It's unfair the way the panel is right now. Do you want to respond to that beyond the Wall Street money?
To my motivations?
No.
No, I mean, you either
No,
accept on face value that what I said or you don't.
To the argument that all of this is somehow or other done by the Republican Party.
Look, I think what we've talked about over the course of the evening is that both parties, and I think humans throughout history who have been in power, try to create rules to keep themselves in power. I think that manifests itself in a lot of ways. I don't think that's a Republican problem. I don't think it's a Democratic problem. I think it's a human problem.
I also will say that Democrats have not been the best stewards of voter participation either. I mean, Democrats have, in the past, been guilty of stopping same-day registration because there was fears that people would get on buses from evangelical churches and then go register all the votes on the same day and sort of ruin the system. So I agree. I think when parties in power again are making decisions and we have winner-take-all elections, we don't really have consideration for minority rights and making sure that those processes get put into place.
Christian?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of think about it empirically. So the research tends to show if you increase turnout dramatically, the chances of changing the outcomes are lower, right? Now, if 9.1% of the public's voting and then 90% votes, the difference would exist. But there's not universal turnout will not always swing elections. In elections like 2000, yes, right? A few more people voting probably would have swung Florida. I'm pretty convinced of that, or counting more ballots that were dismissed. But I do think Democrats have done a lot of this also. Democrats aren't interested in counting military ballots as much in the 2000 election, but were very interested in counting other ballots. Republicans wanted to not count ballots that had a higher propensity to be Democrats for a variety of reasons. And so I think that's an important component too. And I just think that I think we do have more than 9% voting, but I think the campaign finance side of things does give more influence to people who have resources.
One last question, and then we're going to wind this up. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Neil, and I was wondering if you guys could talk more about felon disenfranchisement and kind of like where the line is in terms of like what, the governor of Virginia was doing, like whether there's like a line in terms of whether like in terms of like felons, like whether certain crimes constitute like just a ban on voting in general, or whether like there are certain just like whether there's certain crimes that encapsulate the ability to vote again, while other crimes like aren't as valid to vote again.
There are people who've had their right to vote removed permanently because they were caught with a small amount of marijuana. I mean, it seems to me, and I'm the moderator, so I shouldn't offer an opinion, but it seems to me that a fair, neutral system would say if somebody committed a felony, they were convicted, they served their prison time, they served their probation, they're back out in the world, you want them to stay in the world, you don't want them back in prison, that one of the rights they ought to have as a simple matter of justice is the right to vote. That's what's going to be voted on in Florida in a ballot initiative this November. I have no idea how it will turn out.
And in Alabama, and Mac might know more about this than I do, they changed the felon law to some degree, and that's why the Democrat was able to win, because they worked very hard to get the felons to vote in Alabama.
Okay, I said that was, go ahead, Christian.
I just want to add one more thing on this, because I've done a little work on felon disenfranchisement. So it varies a lot, right? The parolees versus people on probation. Some states don't allow ex-felons. About a third of states don't allow former felons who have completely served their time from voting. And public opinion suggests those laws are actually pretty unpopular. The other laws are. I will also say these are formally disfranchised communities, people who committed felonies who can't vote. But even in states where they have the right to vote or are given the right to vote, this is the lowest propensity turnout group, right? People who have all the demographic characteristics of people that don't turn out, who also have served in prison. They're the hardest people to get out to vote. So while it is a suppression technique, it's not clear that it'll swing a ton of elections when people are granted the right to vote if they don't use it.
I saw you had a question. I ignored you. If we can do it quickly, let's do it.
What are your thoughts on mandatory voting? And my name is Lee. Thank you.
Mandatory voting?
If I'm being honest, I've never considered it. All right. I mean, my career has been in You look at what the law is, and you go get your voters to vote under that law. I probably haven't thought about it enough. I don't know.
I mean, Australia has this system. You get fined if you don't vote. I think the practical bottom line answer here is that there's very little prospect of that passing in this country. It would have to pass state by state. Unless you had some kind of federal enactment, I'm not sure the Supreme Court would uphold it. When you look at the decision on the Voting Rights Act, they very well might strike it down. Christian said, and I thought this was interesting a while ago, that if you had universal voting, in most elections it probably wouldn't change the outcome. There'd be a few, like 2000, where it would probably change the outcome. So anyway, I think we should conclude. I want to thank Gentry, Christian, Danielle, Tim, and this remarkable film that the two of you have made. And I have two final thoughts. One is, I think I agree with Christian and sort of everybody on this panel. We're never going to have an ideal democracy. It's just not going to happen. And people are going to try to hold on to power. But films like this can at least prompt folks to try to make the system better. And we have made the system better over the years. We go backwards sometimes, but then we go forwards. So for me, that's the... Oh, thanks, guys. So for me, that's the bottom line. And I have one last question. Does anybody know what the score of the Yankees-Red Sox game is? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Red Sox 4, Yankees 0.